Hello, welcome to today's skill acquisition screencast. The focus is on the types and uses of guidance. So as you can see there, the specification requires you to have an understanding of 4 different types of guidance. Now, just before we go into these 4 different types, I'm just going to give you a bit of a background to this. So if you've studied GCSE PE, you've probably come across these terms already. So I'm just going to explain exactly what they are, and then how we have to use them or how we have to apply them to exam questions. So ultimately, a coach is responsible, or a teacher, a lot of the times, to help people learn sport skills. These are 4 ways that a coach can use to enhance that learning experience. So they can do it verbally, they can do it visually, they can do it manually, they can do it mechanically. Okay, and all of these have the net aim of aiding the learning of skills. Okay, so what we have to understand then is, how do we use verbal? What is verbal guidance? What is visual? What is manual? What is mechanical? Now, as we work through, you're going to need, in this first section, we're going to need to have an understanding of how to describe each type of guidance and then give it an example. Now, you're more than welcome to add your own examples, but for now I'm just going to give you one example, and you can change that if you want to. Okay, but just check it with me before you do so. So if I go through first up, then what is verbal guidance? So if a coach is trying to guide someone through learning a skill, if they're going to use verbal guidance, they would do it in the following way. They would use instructions or coaching points as an example to aid learning. Okay, so verbal instructions to aid learning. I haven't put verbal because I don't want to repeat the word. So instructions to aid learning. For example, a coach telling a footballer to use the side of the foot to pass. Okay, now you could use your own examples there, of course, but in terms of time, I'm going to move on to the next one now. Now, the second type of guidance you could use is visual guidance. So in terms of this, a coach would use demonstrations to aid learning. Okay, so for example, a football coach demonstrating a pass, a netball coach demonstrating a pass. So you can use, I've tried to change the examples a little bit there. So as you can see, there are first 2, and I imagine these are the most common, the thing that most people would understand. Okay, they've either been a coach or they've been coached where someone's told them what to do using instructions, and they've also been shown what to do by looking at demonstrations. Okay, and they would be the 2 that tend to get used most commonly in most sports skills. Okay, so we would have seen a combination of those. All right, so they are our first 2, making sure we just translate to the red word here when we are trying to describe it. If the question asks you to describe with examples, you would need to have examples linked to the different skills you're going to use. Okay, so if that's 2 ways, the most common ways, what other ways could a coach guide a learner through a movement skill? Okay, manual guidance is the next one. So manual guidance then refers to the use of physical manipulation to aid learning. Okay, so what does that mean? If a gymnast is trying to go through a cartwheel, physical manipulation means that the coach uses their hands to help them through the cartwheel movement, or the coach uses their hands to help them move through the body position of a putt in golf. Okay, so these are the type of things you might use, but the coach physically, using their hands, manipulates the performer through the skill. Okay, gymnastics, a key example of that, and you've got to remember this is skill acquisition, not sport acquisition, so we have to give the specific skill within gymnastics that a coach might help with. Okay, so cartwheel's a good one there you could use, for example. Now if we carry on from here and say, right, manual guidance then is the use of physical manipulation. Okay, what then is mechanical guidance? So mechanical guidance is very similar, but this time, instead of a coach physically using their hands to manipulate the performer through a skill, now we have mechanical guidance, which is the use of equipment to aid the learning of a movement skill. So for example, in trampolining, there's so many places now you can go trampolining. You even see trampolining sometimes in shopping centres. I see it, and there's actual trampolining centres now where people go for fun. And if people want to try and, I suppose, move onto a more complex skill sometimes, or they're just scared, you can use a harness. Okay, so example of a harness, it will attach to you to a trampolinist, which would allow them to try a somersault, for example, but with the safety net of knowing that they're attached to that harness in case anything goes wrong. So that is something there that you can add in. So use of equipment, e.g. using a harness to allow a trampolinist to practice a somersault. So they are the key examples I wanted you to use. You're more than welcome to add your own, but I would suggest using these for now, okay? Because these will be the ones that are guaranteed to be correct. And if people want to use any other ones, you can just come and see me and just check that they're right before moving on with them. Okay, so if that's that then, that takes us to our first section of learning. You've got to be able to describe and apply to examples. So ultimately now you have done the first two assessment objectives. You can describe them, you can apply them to examples. Now what we have to do is go on to probably not the toughest part, but the highest order assessment objective. We've now got to be able to give advantages and disadvantages for each type of guidance. Okay, so what I'm going to say to you now is this. I want you to follow a route through on this. So when we are looking to give advantages and disadvantages for each type of guidance, I'm really keen on you using your previous learning in skill acquisition to allow you to evaluate effectively. Okay, so the type of questions you might get evaluate visual guidance, evaluate verbal guidance. And when you do that, I think it's really important that you use the following steps. Okay, we're going to use the stage of learning that the guidance would be most effective for and sometimes least effective for. So when we start to give an advantage or a disadvantage, for example, I'll give you one in a minute. So visual guidance, what stage of learning do we think visual guidance might be most effective for? Okay, that might be something to just consider. Then, once we've done that, we then have to justify the reason we've linked it to that stage of learning using some key terminology. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to talk you through. You do not need to write anything I say now, okay, because I'll be going through this on the next slide. If we were looking, and like I said a second ago, at the advantages and disadvantages of visual guidance. So I'm just going to put my cursor here. Visual guidance, use of demonstrations to aid learning, e.g. a coach demonstrating a pass in netball. So if I was going to say there, right, what stage of learning do I think that is most effective for? Okay, so I think that stage of learning of visual guidance will be most effective for the cognitive stage of learning. So that then will give me, that is automatically giving me an advantage. It's most effective for the cognitive stage of learning. And then I would need to justify why. So for example, I might say that it is most effective for the cognitive stage of learning, advantage 1, because, and you will remember this from your previous learning on the cognitive stage of learning, it allows the performer to create a mental picture of the skill. So by going on 2 steps, okay, picking the stage of learning it's most effective for, and then justifying it with some key terminology that you've already been taught, you have already got 2 evaluation points or 2 advantages of the cognitive stage of learning. So I just wanted to talk you through, because that's how we're going to go through the rest of the screencast, just so you understand. When we're evaluating or giving advantages and disadvantages of guidance type, we will always start our advantage with what stage of learning it's most effective for, and then use some key terminology to expand and develop our advantages. Okay, so let's have a look then. How we're going to start. We'll start with visual guidance, as I've just gone through that now. Now you can start making notes. So I've kept the description up here as a reference point. You've already got it. So if you don't want to remake that note, you don't have to. So I went from here. So we've got to look at the advantages and disadvantages. As I said on the previous slide, we are going to use the stage of learning, okay, that we think it's most effective for. We're going to justify that using key terminology. So first one will be done for you, but I will add a little bit to it. So when we're looking at evaluating visual guidance, the advantages of visual guidance are it's most effective for performers in the cognitive stage of learning to allow them to create a mental picture. So hopefully you can see what a simple start that is in terms of evaluating visual guidance. Now, if we have a look at the disadvantages then, if these are our advantages, most effective for performers in the cognitive stage of learning because it allows them to create a mental picture. Now, I'm sure you can imagine there is a real problem with this. So if we do a demonstration that is incorrect, we are going to encourage poor technique. So the key thing with regard to the disadvantage of visual guidance is to do with the demonstration being incorrect. So it's ineffective if that demo is incorrect, or this is another thing directly linked to the demonstration, if it's too fast for the performer to follow. So for example, you do a poor technique, and a lot of people will say that, say for example, they didn't learn to throw when they were young. Okay, now this could be due to the fact that somebody who taught a young person to throw taught them with the wrong technique. Secondly, when they did it, they were too fast, they went through it really quick, and the performer couldn't really see it. Okay, so 2 things there that could be really quite difficult difficult with regard to visual guidance. So they are your disadvantages there, both of them directly linked to the demonstration, either being incorrect or too fast to follow. So if we go on from here, let's have a look at our next type of guidance. So, verbal guidance, as you can see, I'll leave that description example at the top point. Okay, use of instructions, coach telling footballers to use the side of foot to pass. That's one example. Now, again, same process. And this one is brilliant because you get to use the stage of learning for both advantage and disadvantage. So what I'm going to do is go through this now. So if we start off, in terms of verbal guidance, which stage of learning is verbal guidance most effective for? And it is most effective, and I'm going to say this point now. When I say this, every guidance type is used for every stage of learning. It's as simple as that. But we can say that they're most effective for certain stages of learning, if that makes sense. So if we start off with verbal guidance, it is considered to be most effective for the autonomous or performers in the autonomous stage of learning. And the reason why it is considered most effective for these stages of learning, for the autonomous stages, is because it allows the coach to explain how to perform complex or in-depth skills and tactics. Okay, so it allows them to talk about tactical points. For example, it might talk about specialist terminology such as pressing in hockey. Okay, so how they're going to press high in hockey, how they're going to squeeze to one side, and because you can use technical verbal terminology, it allows you to explain to autonomous performers how to perform those in-depth or complex tactics. Okay, so if that's our key advantage, that is why it is considered most effective for the autonomous stage of learning. The disadvantages then, if we look at what is not so good about this, verbal guidance can be less effective for performers in the cognitive stage of learning. And the reason being is when you're starting to learn a skill, if too much information is given to a cognitive stage learner, okay, and they're told 5 or 6 coaching points at the same time, this can lead to something where your brain cannot process all of the verbal information that is coming in. You've probably been there yourself. And this is known as information overload. Okay, so the key thing there, it's too much verbal guidance is less effective for performance in the cognitive stage because of that creation of information overload. Now, on top of that, if the verbal guidance, very similar to visual guidance, if the verbal instructions are incorrect or inaccurate, it can lead to errors. Okay, so we get that same point there. Whatever the mechanism, if it's a demo and it's incorrect, that can lead to poor technique. If the instruction is inaccurate or incorrect, this can lead to errors long term. So I just want to finish it up there just for now, so just get you to have a look at that. So I said to you at the very start of this slide, we need to make sure, so we know that visual guidance, going back, we know that that's most effective for cognitive stage learners, and then we now know that verbal guidance can be considered most effective for autonomous stage learners because it allows you to explain how to perform in-depth tactics, and it's less effective for cognitive stage learners as it can lead to information overload. Okay, and if inaccurate, can lead to errors. I need to add a section on here. Hopefully people will get this. Sometimes verbal guidance can be used effectively with cognitive stage learners, so for beginners. So I need you to add a footnote to this, and this is only for specific questions. Sometimes verbal guidance can be effective for cognitive stage learners for the following reasons. If cognitive stage learners are daydreaming, not focused, it can help you to focus their attentions and motivate. And it could just say, what are you doing? What did I just say? Okay, you know those type of things when people are learning for the very first time. So I wanted you to add this footnote to say, okay, we've said that verbal guidance is most effective for autonomous stages, but it can be effective for cognitive stage learners if it's being used to focus attention, to motivate people. Come on, you can do it. I know you can do it. It can be useful in those ways. Okay, so I just want you to add that to it, although our general principles are as we have up here. Okay, so if we move on to our last 2 types of guidance and evaluating them. But before I do that, I just want to show you how this might look in an exam question. I think this is really useful at this point. So I'm going to show you this now. Marking the exams. Last time we did the exams. This is something I came across a lot. And I've titled this How Not to Evaluate Guidance. As you can see, this exam question here, evaluate the use of verbal and visual guidance in the learning and movement skills. Okay, so this question, because it says evaluate, It means you have to go straight in to the advantages and disadvantages. Now, if you have a look at this student, what they've done is they've got it and they've said verbal guidance is the use of instructions. Visual guidance is the use of demonstration. Now, they are not advantages and disadvantages. So a quick piece of exam technique is that when you get a question in A-level PE, OCR specification, when you get a question that says evaluate, you get no credit for describing. Okay, you have to get straight in to giving the advantages and disadvantages, because this is asking you to evaluate. So if I show you onto here how it could look, how it should look, a model example of this, if you were going to do this effectively, if we pick one of them, I'm going to pick visual guidance now. What we've just looked at is how you use visual guidance to evaluate, stages of learning to evaluate visual guidance. So if you have a look at how this student has done it, on their first 3 lines, they have put from here, visual guidance is good for, straight away, going into a strength, cognitive performers, 1 mark, because it helps them to create a mental picture. 2 marks. Okay, so you can see the difference in that. If it asks you to evaluate, you've got to give advantages straight away. Secondly, you must make sure that you use this process of a stage of learning for an advantage, and then giving the specific terminology that justifies why that stage of learning would find that guidance type most effective. Okay, so I thought that was important to put in there just so you see exactly why you're doing what you're doing. If we go on to our last 2 types of guidance, now we know that manual is the use of physical manipulation. So, for example, a coach helping someone through a trampolining move or a cartwheel. Mechanical guidance is the use of equipment to aid the learning. Okay, so I'll put here harness, but then I've also put down here a picture of a young person using a bike with stabilizers. That would be an example of mechanical guidance. Now, what we're going to do, and this is what I find really, really helpful on this bit, although we have to describe manual and mechanical differently because one's equipment, one's physical manipulation, when you give the advantages and disadvantages, you use the same ones, because being aided through a skill by physical manipulation and also being aided through a skill by equipment, although they're different, they have the same advantages and disadvantages. So let's have a look. So if I said to you, now you can kind of pick up on here, which stage of learning might manual and mechanical guidance be most effective for? It's going to be most effective for the cognitive stage of learning. Now, if we consider why, and we look here now, what is going to be good about using stabilizers as the mechanical guidance type here? Well, the key thing here is if you didn't have those stabilizers on, or if that young person didn't have that stabilizers on, they would probably feel quite scared. So what it does is by having them there, it will increase their confidence. On top of that, but the fact they've got these, it means they're less likely to fall off. One of the reasons why they're confident. So that straight away is going to increase their safety. Okay, and on top of that, okay, if we imagine that they weren't there, this person would probably be on the floor. Okay, they would not be able to ride their bike. So what it does is it gives them, by balancing it for them, okay, by putting the stabilizers on, it gives them kinesthesis. Okay, so it gives them this feel. It develops kinesthesis. Now, you might have come across this term, you might not have. Kinesthesis is an example of intrinsic feedback, or the feel of how something is going to, an action is going to be performed. So, for example, you can see here they can get the pedal action because of this balance in them. They get the feel of pedaling and riding a bike. Okay, the feel, we have to translate that into kinesthesis, okay, as a sense that we use and develop if we use kind of mechanical or manual guidance. Now, what are the disadvantages then to this? First one, okay, now if you carry on with this too long, what can happen is people get so comfortable with using things such as stabilizers, things such as harnesses in trampolining, is they become over-reliant, okay, on it. So that they want to stay with it forever. They don't want to get rid of it. It feels comfortable. I'm not going to have any problems. I'm not going to fall off, and therefore I want to stay with it. The other, and this is so key. Although we have said that by having, say, for example, in this case, stabilizers on a bike, it develops kinesthesis, that sense of feeling the movement. We all know there is a massive difference between cycling with stabilizers and not. We also know, for example, I don't know if people are aware, if people go to the gym and you use what are considered free weights, where you have to balance the weight yourself, versus when you have a machine weight. Now, when you're on the machine weight, you get the feeling or the kinesthesis, for example, of doing a bench press movement, but on a chest press where it's supported by a machine. When you then go and do a bench press free weight where you have to balance it yourself, you realize that it is not the same movement. So the problem with mechanical and manual guidance and developing kinesthesis, often it develops false kinesthesis, so it's not correct. So that's a really, really important point to finish off on there. Okay, so there are your advantages and disadvantages of those. Please make sure you have got good notes on those. A nice, easy one. I like this one. I feel like it makes a lot of sense. Okay, most of you will have had some kind of experience on a gym machine where it makes you feel more confident. Safety is less chance of dropping the weights on you, and it gives you a feeling of that movement. But realistically, you can become over reliant on the gym machine, and it can lead to false kinesthesis because it's not the same movement. Okay, because when you have to balance it yourself, that's where the equilibrium comes in. It can be more difficult, so it can lead to false kinesthesis. Okay, thanks very much. Please make good notes.